my fellow Atlanta Falcons fan, Mr. Thomas Vernon Strange Jr., to please come and give us a talk on Jefferson Davis after the war.
I honestly say I've spoke behind some people in the past, but I've never spoke behind a governor. Please excuse my speech because I'm sure it's not going to be near as good as that one was. When Jim asked me, I'd done some research on Jefferson Davis in the past, but mainly about Mississippi and stuff like that because of my locality being from North Alabama. And I'm glad y'all asked me to come because I learned some things about Jefferson Davis that I'd never realized. After 2 years of being in prison at Fort Monroe, he was released on bail and enjoyed an enthusiastic reception here in Richmond. And then he visited Europe for a while. Returning home, he kind of avoided the spotlight, if you will, if we say it in today's term. He would appear in public, but, just occasionally, and mainly just doing writings and such as that. He frankly admitted after the war that secession was no longer possible. Of course, like Teresa and I were talking a minute ago, of course the Union was at every corner standing back then too. He counseled with the Southern people to recover its wasted resources and maintain its principles. Y'all, excuse me, I'm having to read off of this because my typing was not near big enough. Let's see, okay. The last and unyielding opposer of power centralized in the federal government. Now and then, public demonstrations revealed the attachment of the Southern people, especially two occasions in Georgia, one being the unveiling of the Ben Hill statue in Atlanta, and the other being in Macon during the state agricultural fair. These popular demonstrations were of such an imposing character as to the evidence the undiminished attachment of the people of his personal character and sympathy for him in his misfortunes. But, at this point, he was like many Southern plantation owners. He was broke. Just like many of our ancestors. Right. They had no home. Especially Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee. When they came back from the war, they didn't have a home. And no money. Let's see. Along with thousands of others, he had gambled all and lost all on the Confederate cause. With a wife and 4 children, aged 3 to 12 to provide for, he lived in Canada and England hoping to find a suitable job. In 1869, he became the president of the Carolina Life Insurance Company in Memphis, Tennessee, where he resided at the Peabody Hotel. Upon General Lee's death in 1870, Davis presided over the memorial meeting in Memphis, and he was elected to the U.S. Senate again, but he was refused office in 1875, having been barred from federal office by Section 3 of the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. He also turned down the first job as president of what is now Texas A&M University. I never knew that, but he had been offered that job there. In 1876, however, his fortunes changed. A longtime admirer, Sarah Ann Ellis Dorsey, a wealthy widow who had heard of his difficulties, invited him to stay at her estate and plantation house, Beauvoir, on the Mississippi Gulf Coast in Biloxi. There Davis was home at last. He loved Beauvoir, a property that provided a welcome to peace and quiet. She provided him with a cabin for his own use and helped him with his writings through organization, dictation, editing, and encouragement. Knowing that she was severely ill, in 1878, she made her will, leaving Beauvoir and her financial assets of $50,000, which in today's money is $1.2 million to $27,000. To Jefferson Davis, in case of his death, the only surviving child, Winnie Davis, would receive it. She died in 1879, by which time both the Davises and Winnie were living at Beauvoir. He had many visitors while he was on the Mississippi coast. In fact, from time to time, some of his writings said there were too many visitors. As a famous person, he was sought out by journalists, tourists, friends, all of whom wanted to know more about his long, action-packed public career, especially about the American War between the states. In the days before telephones, interviews and conversations were face-to-face. The guests arrived in wagons or stepped off the train at Beauvoir Station, which was about a half a mile away from the house. The visitors would often eat outdoors on the broad verandas and while talking with Davis about his books. People he knew in Washington before the war and in Richmond during the war came and visited very often down there, and they would discuss, politics and such. In 1877, he wrote this about Beauvoir, which I thought was fairly interesting. He said, "The sea is immediately in front, and an extensive orange orchard is near. Beyond that is one of the clear brooks, common to the pine woods, its banks lined with tanglewood of sweet bay, wild olive, and vines. By night, I hear the murmur of the sea rolling onto the beach. By day, short walks brings one to where the winds sigh through the pines, a sad yet soothing sound." During the 1880s, he penned his 2-volume memoir about the war, The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government, along with another book and several magazine articles. He and his wife, who had helped him with the writing, entertained rafts of visitors, and they regained ownership of Briarfield after a long legal battle. Davis resumed extensive traveling, speaking mainly at Confederate veterans events. His reputation among the ex-Confederates was restored by the book and by his warm reception on his tour of the region in 1886 and 1887. Numerous stops he attended lost cause ceremonies where large crowds showered him with affection, and local leaders presented emotional speeches honoring his sacrifices to the would-be nation. Such events helped the South come to terms with their defeat and continued for decades after the war. The Meridian Daily Journal stated that Davis, at a reception held in New Orleans in 1887, urged Southerners to be loyal to the nation. He's quoted as saying, "United you are now, and if the Union is ever to be broken, let the other side break it." Think about that for a second. This country was divided in 1861 to 1865. Less than 50 years later, both sides came together and sent their sons and grandsons to Europe to fight in World War I. We went a long way in those 50 years, just like we came a long way the other way over the last 100 years. But when I read that really kind of, hit me. He stated the Confederacy had successfully fought for their own rights with inferior numbers during the war, and that the Northern historians ignored this view. Go figure. But he was optimistic concerning American prosperity and the next generation. In 1889, he completed a short history of the Confederate States of America. On November 6, he left Beauvoir to visit his plantation at Briarfield. While in New Orleans, he was caught in a sleety rain, and on a steamboat trip upriver, he had a severe cold. On the 13th of November, he left Briarfield to return to New Orleans. Mrs. Davis, who had taken another boat to Briarfield, met him on the river, and he finally received some medical care. 2 doctors came aboard further south and found he had acute bronchitis complicated by malaria. They arrived in New Orleans 3 days later, and he was taken to the home of Charles Fenner, an associate judge of the Louisiana Supreme Court. Davis remained in bed and was stable for the next 2 weeks. However, he took a turn for the worse in early December, and on December 5th, passed away at 12:45. On December 6th, at 12:45 a.m., he passed away in the presence of several friends. He was buried at in New Orleans at Metairie Cemetery, and in 1893 he was brought here and buried here. It's amazing when I started reading about that. I knew he was a great man. I knew a lot of stuff he did before the war. being a senator and Secretary of War, things like that. But when you really start looking into it, it's heartbreaking, really. But there was a song by a singer a few years ago. All gave some, but some gave all. And that's relevant with Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, a lot of these gentlemen that we honor today, and that they're wanting to take their statues away. One quick note: down the road here, there's a university called it's Virginia, and when we had to deal with the release statue there, I had a journalist from the college newspaper call me. This is what we're dealing with, ladies and gentlemen. She asked me, she said, what would you say? She said, there's a push to remove the Thomas Jefferson statue on campus here. And I said, why is that? She said, well, there are students that are afraid to go past it because it's so big. And I said, you've got to be kidding me. And she said, no, that's why they're wanting to remove it. She said, what would you say to that? And I said, well, I said, well, what would you say if I said, I don't want to go take that English class because it's in a 10-story building and I only want to go 8 floors up, so I can't go take that class. She said, well, that would be ridiculous. And I said, well, there you have it. But y'all, that's the people we've got to get into. We've got to get them to understand these men, these people. Fitzgerald, Lee down here, Stewart in the cemetery here. We've got to educate these folks, y'all. Once again, thank you. It's been a pleasure, and I enjoyed being here. Thank you, Jim.